For centuries, Europe was ruled by men on horseback. Armored knights, symbols of power, wealth, and divine right, charged across muddy fields believing no common foot soldier could ever bring them down. But what if they were wrong? What if one quiet, bloody shift in warfare, led not by kings, but by farmers, peasants, and townsmen, broke the back of chivalry itself? Because by the late Middle Ages, the world was changing. And when it did, everything about war, about class, power, and even the structure of kingdoms would change with it. Stay till the end, because what began as a tactical shift on muddy battlefields became a social earthquake that shaped the birth of modern Europe. If you love uncovering the hidden revolutions that changed history forever, you're in the right place. Welcome to Sleeping Historian. For much of medieval Europe, warfare had a clear hierarchy. At the top rode the knight, a mounted noble encased in steel, his lance lowered like a thunderbolt of God. Chroniclers, monks, and poets alike glorified him as the ultimate warrior. Brave, unstoppable, born to rule by sword and faith. And for a while, it was true. A knight on horseback, with the weight of his armor and the power of his destrier behind him, could smash through infantry lines like a storm tearing through fields of wheat. To face such a charge was to face death itself. But beneath the poetry, something was changing, because as the centuries rolled on, new weapons, new tactics, and new kinds of soldiers began to challenge that old order. And soon, the age of the knight would begin to crumble, under the boots of men who could barely afford shoes. Historians have debated this infantry revolution for decades. Did foot soldiers really dethrone the mounted elite? Or did they just share the stage for a little while before artillery and gunpowder swept them both away? Some say this revolution wasn't just military. It was social, political, even economic. That the rise of infantry didn't just change how wars were fought. It changed who held power in Europe itself. Because when peasants learned how to kill nobles, it wasn't just the battlefield that shifted. It was the balance of the world. To understand the revolution, we need to step back to the age when knights ruled everything. In the High Middle Ages, roughly between 1000 and 1300, the knight was Europe's tank. Armed with a lance tucked beneath his arm, a technique made deadly by the stirrup and the heavy saddle, he could hit like a living missile. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a political system on horseback. Because knights weren't just soldiers, they were nobles. Feudalism itself was built around their power. They owned the land, commanded peasants, and owed loyalty to kings in exchange for one thing: the right to fight. When a medieval army gathered, it wasn't a professional force. It was a pyramid of obligations. Lords, vassals, squires, each bringing men, horses, and weapons. War was an extension of hierarchy, but hierarchy can't last forever when the battlefield stops obeying it. Even in the age of the knight, there were moments when the foot soldier refused to break. At Falkirk in 1298, Scottish spearmen stood against the charge of English cavalry. At Courtrai in 1302, Flemish townsmen, armed with little more than pikes and courage, broke the flower of French chivalry. And in the mountain passes of Morgarten in 1315, Swiss farmers ambushed armored nobles and sent them tumbling into lakes and ravines. How could untrained peasants, wielding poles and pitchforks, destroy the most powerful knights in Europe? It wasn't magic. It was evolution. Battlefields were no longer open plains for cavalry to dominate. They were forests, swamps, and narrow passes where horses struggled to maneuver. And the men who fought there, fighting for their homes, their towns, their freedom, had every reason to stand their ground. Still, these were exceptions, not revolutions. Not yet. By the 14th century, something deeper was happening. Wars were lasting longer. Armies were getting bigger. And Europe's rulers, especially in England and France, needed soldiers who could fight not just for a season, but for years. Feudal levies couldn't keep up. The world needed professionals. So kings began hiring men to fight for money. Not loyalty. Mercenaries, archers, pikemen. And as they did, the old feudal code started to crack. Now, the power to wage war depended not on noble birth, but on the ability to pay. And the man who could tax his people most efficiently became the man who ruled them. That single change would plant the seeds for modern statehood itself. Then came the weapon that terrified Europe, the English longbow. 6 feet of yew. Simple but lethal. In the right hands, it could send an arrow through mail, leather, and pride. At Crécy in 1346, French knights charged uphill into a storm of arrows and fell in heaps before ever reaching the enemy. At Poitiers, the same disaster struck again. And at Agincourt in 1415, mud, exhaustion, and the relentless hail of English arrows turned one of Europe's most powerful armies into a slaughter. The battlefield had spoken. It wasn't armor that won the day anymore. It was discipline, coordination, the collective will of common men who fought together, not as heroes, but as one. The English archers proved that courage could be mass-produced. As the 15th century dawned, another force was rising from the mountains of Switzerland. The Swiss pikemen, disciplined, fearless, and united, marched in dense blocks bristling with steel. Their pikes stretched 15 feet long, and when knights charged, they met a living wall of spear points. They didn't hide behind walls or fortifications. They charged forward. For the first time, infantry became not just a shield, but a sword. Their victories at battles like Laupen, Murten, and Nancy sent shock waves through Europe. How could farmers defeat dukes? How could peasants rout professionals? Soon, everyone wanted their own Swiss. Mercenary companies called Landsknechts formed in Germany, copying their tactics and spirit. Even emperors marched on foot with them, shoulder to shoulder. The message was clear. The world no longer bowed to the knight. But this transformation didn't stop at the battlefield. Warfare was expensive. More soldiers meant more pay, more weapons, more logistics. Kings had to collect taxes like never before. And that meant creating something new: bureaucracy. Suddenly, kingdoms like France and England needed officials, accountants, and clerks, an entire machinery of government to fund their wars. And just like that, the medieval world of feudal oaths gave way to the modern state. It was no longer the knight who held power. It was the crown. The king's power flowed from parchment, ink, and coin, not the tip of a lance. War had forced Europe to grow up. Of course, revolutions never stop where they begin. By the mid-1400s, a new weapon entered the stage, one that made even the longbow obsolete: gunpowder. At first, cannons were slow, clumsy, and dangerous to their own crews. But by 1450, they were powerful enough to blast castle walls to dust. The age of the siege was over. The age of fire had begun. Ironically, that shift gave cavalry a temporary rebirth. With walls falling faster, battles once again moved into open fields where speed and shock mattered. But even there, infantry evolved. Musketeers replaced archers. Pikemen stood beside them, guarding their flanks. Together, they formed the backbone of new, professional armies. Soldiers of state, not servants of lords. The old world was gone. So was the infantry revolution really about tactics and weapons? Or was it something much bigger? Maybe it wasn't the pike or the longbow that changed history. Maybe it was the idea that ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, and townsmen could stand in formation and defeat the nobility who had ruled them for centuries. Once that idea took root, there was no turning back. Armies became reflections of the societies that built them. Organized, disciplined, collective. And from those armies, nations were born. In England, the longbowmen of the Hundred Years' War returned home with experience and anger. They had fought for their kings, watched friends die, and come back to poverty and taxes. In 1381, they rose up in rebellion under Wat Tyler, many still carrying the weapons that had made them heroes abroad. It was crushed, yes, but the idea remained, that a common man could rise, could fight, could matter. Across Europe, similar transformations echoed. The Swiss used their newfound fame to build independence and wealth. The mercenary bands they inspired became both feared and respected, and the feudal nobility, once Europe's untouchable elite, found themselves slowly replaced by paid officers and gun-wielding professionals. Power had shifted forever. And yet, the story is not so simple. The knight never truly disappeared. He evolved into the officer, the commander, the professional soldier. Armor changed, weapons changed, but the idea of elite warriors persisted in new forms. So maybe the infantry revolution wasn't about the destruction of the old world, but about its transformation. A world once ruled by individuals, the lords, the champions, the heroes, was becoming a world ruled by systems. And systems, once created, are hard to destroy. When we look back at those battlefields, Crécy, Courtrai, Bannockburn, Morgarten, we don't just see tactics or formations. We see humanity learning something profound, that unity can defeat privilege, that training and courage can outweigh titles and bloodlines, that the collective will of many can break the power of the few. The infantry revolution wasn't just a military shift. It was the moment when Europe's peasants stopped kneeling and started fighting for a future that would eventually belong to them. So the next time someone says history is written by kings, remember this. Sometimes it's written by the men who refused to run. This is Sleeping Historian, and if you've made it this far, you're one of us. Curious, relentless, and unwilling to let the truth of the past stay buried. Subscribe, stay curious, and remember, even the smallest soldier can start the biggest revolution.